Welcome to Digital Therapeutics edition of Digital Health Today, and I'm your host, Eugene Borukhovich. We've been a little quiet on this podcast, and I really appreciate all the feedback you've given to me to let me know how much this podcast means to you. Producing a podcast requires a lot of time, dedication, and yes, financial resources to be able to bring a quality experience to you, our loyal listeners. And while I thoroughly enjoy bringing you discussions with incredible industry leaders, we always need to make sure we have all the resources in place. As we discussed in our previous episode with Mike Pace, 2023 was a really tough year for DTx. Given the significant developments, dare I say, improvements in the industry so far in 2024, I felt it was important to update our community on the positive tailwinds we've seen in advancing much-needed digital therapies for patients. But before I introduce the special episode and the leaders that will be joining me today, I pause just for 5 seconds to give you the time to rate this podcast in your favorite player and maybe share it with your colleagues. It would mean the world to me. Today, I'm doing something completely different. And instead of my usual one-on-one conversations, I've invited some truly amazing individuals to more of a panel discussion. First and foremost, I would like to introduce two guests that are no strangers to this podcast and have been here before. Dr. Jenna Carl is Chief Medical Officer at Big Health, where she advances the company's clinical strategy and industry-leading body of clinical evidence that validates the safety and efficacy of digital mental health programs. One quick important note, she is a practicing clinical psychologist who specializes in research and treatment of anxiety, depression, insomnia, and related mental health disorders. Also welcoming back Andy Molnar, who is CEO of Digital Therapeutics Alliance, a trade organization focused on the needs of clinically validated digital therapeutics industry. He was also appointed to the FDA's Digital Health Advisory Committee earlier this year. And now it's my pleasure to introduce two new guests on this podcast. Marty Culjat is the SVP, Global Head of Digital Medicine and Regulatory Innovation at Eversana. He is widely recognized as an expert in regulatory affairs and strategy in digital health and a thought leader at the intersection of digital health and pharma. And last but not least, we have Kirsten Tullia, who is serving as a Senior Vice President, Payment and Healthcare Delivery Policy at the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed. In this position, she covers a wide range of policy issues with a particular focus on the Medicare fee-for-service payment systems, digital health technology coverage, and payment and alternative payment models. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into this episode. Welcome to the DTx Podcast. I got an amazing crew today. I'll be honest with you guys, I have missed this. I know it's been almost 9 months since I've recorded my last one, so I'm super excited to give our audience a great update on where the DTx industry have been in the last 9 months. Before we dive into the kind of detailed content and get people really excited about this, I do want to do a little bit of an icebreaker, and I would love for each one of you guys just say a quick one word about the DTx industry's future. What is the one word that comes to your mind? And I'll start with Andy.
Transformational.
Kirsten.
Bright.
Marty.
Evolving.
Jenna.
2025.
Love it.
Love it. So I think it accomplished what we wanted. I know to a certain extent we're all drinking our own Kool-Aid. And so I want us to be somewhat critical as well and challenging each other. And if you guys don't, I might just do that throughout our discussion. But kind of without further ado, let's dive right in. I mean, I think, Andy, maybe you can take us through from a DTA and just overall industry perspective, rewind back, I guess, 2023, let's not go there. I think we all know what happened. There's been tremendous lessons learned through it, but, rewind us 9 months or so, sort of some key aspects, and including the DTA summit, I think, as well, that took place earlier in the year.
So I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on the past, but we know that 2023 was rough. And that started going into 2024 as well. And I think I'll just leave it at that for the past. Everybody knows that. That's fine. I'm sure Mike Pace at your last podcast talked all about the issues that were going.
We did.
Now, at our summit, which was early June, so the Digital Therapeutics Alliance Summit in Washington, D.C., I got up on stage and I said, the end of this terrible phase is over. We're going to thank it for happening so that we can recognize how difficult changing healthcare is, and we're going to move on. And people, it was a mixed bag. People said, oh, maybe you're right. Maybe you're wrong. I'm right. I'm absolutely right. The momentum is back in full force. But I think the difference now is it's not just hype, it's realistic momentum. Okay. And we talked about things like PDURS, right, which we're going to talk about more. That's prescription drug use related software for our listeners. So combo products with software and prescription drugs with pharma. I talked to a lot of people on the Hill about aging in place, right? The only solution is digital therapeutics. It's not like you can put a doctor in everybody's house. And then the physician fee schedule comes out, which again, we're going to talk about more, but new codes for mental health devices that actually cover therapeutic interventions. Incredible. And with that, we're also seeing global expansion. So I started kind of teasing some of this. I could not have predicted that the CMS physician fee schedule is going to come out a month and a half later with codes at starting what we asked for last year and have been asking for multiple years now. So it's really an exciting time.
Amazing. Well, unless anybody else wants to throw in some other happenings, I know Jenna Big Health got an FDA approval. I don't know if anybody else wants to throw in some other just exciting things.
One to mention as well was pretty interesting was HR 8816. That's also one that I think we should talk about here today as well.
Marty, why don't you kick us off with that one real quick, just for our listeners to catch up on that, and then we'll dive right into the PDURS after that.
I don't know that I'm the best qualified here on this call to talk about 8816, but it's a new bill in Congress that has a few different pieces in it. The most interesting one is that it directs Medicare or CMS to find a way to pay for software as a medical device through existing benefit categories within CMS. There was a big report that AdvaMed did, 3-4 years ago now, that was fantastic. That did look at a lot of different ways that SAMD could be paid for, today using, current benefit categories and sort of interpreting them in a different way. My understanding, and I'm sure, Kristen knows more about this than I do, is that that's something that kind of sprang out of that, and that there are some possible avenues where you wouldn't need an act of Congress to be able to reimburse software as a medical device.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to play a phone a friend on this one because there are a couple of different pieces of 8816 that are really interesting. I think the big piece for this case is the prescription digital therapeutics. And what we see in 8816 is this really streamlined version of the general thrust behind the Access to PDT Act, which is, ensuring that CMS and Medicare looks at its existing benefit categories expansively, which they did in the physician fee schedule proposed rule. And then they also undertake, and the piece I think as a policy nerd I find the most interesting, is that they undertake a really nuanced review and then develop a report about what they feel that they can't currently cover under their existing benefit categories. And that they provide feedback to the Hill about what additional statutory authorities they would need in order to be able to do that, which is, I think, really, really important, especially in the context of kind of a post-Chevron world, where we will be looking more and more towards the legislative intent behind different pieces of work in order to justify agency action. So there's some really cool stuff in there and in the larger Medicare kind of digital health tech world, which is exciting to see.
Listen, bonus, and I think appreciate you guys quick, and we're trying to keep this tight for our listeners. So this was a great overview. I do want to get to a topic, honestly, near and dear to my heart when I spent some time in big pharma. And, I always looked at things where you either partner with pharma or you're a standalone DTx, right? And there are entrepreneurs that took both routes. And I think it was always challenging for the entrepreneurs that are partnering with pharma just based on the kind of the cycles of change, let's put it a politically correct way, how long pharma takes. But I think PDURS, brings us to kind of the next level. And there's obviously players that took that route specifically. But Marty, I think this is where you can kind of chime in and let's give a little bit of an overview of how this was even born, for lack of a better term, and what does this mean? And more importantly, what does this mean for us as the patients and consumers of this?
Sure, Eugene. So this was really initiated back in the early days of this DTx kind of time frame. And so back in 2018, the FDA introduced a framework on the Federal Register that did kind of lay out how they envisioned software to be paired with drugs. This was back in a time when Abilify MySite was kind of going through the process, and that was a product that was being launched, and that had a lot of mind share at the time. And then it's also a time when we as an industry within DTx were talking about how we saw the pharma partnerships as DTx being the toy and the happy meal, right? That was sort of a nice little add-on that pharma reps could go sell alongside a brand. Well, this new framework, kind of the way I've been putting it is that it's more, instead of being the toy and the happy meal, it's more of like the pickle on the cheeseburger or the cheese on the cheeseburger.
Got all kinds of analogies today.
Yeah, where instead in this case, you actually can add software to the drug label if you're able to demonstrate a clinically meaningful benefit to the drug. So the framework really, it's not only about standalone software. It actually focuses on, promotional software, how you can use patient support software, promotional software side alongside a drug. It talks a lot about device connected software. So for example, Abilify MySite or auto injectors where you have software tied to a medical device. That's part of a combination product, but also it has a carve out for standalone software where if you can demonstrate that there is a clinically meaningful benefit that the software provides to a drug, you also can add the software itself to the drug label. So it's kind of a new framework that really articulates how you could pair software with drugs that hasn't really been around before. And there have been a lot of, a lot of hurdles over the years and definitely some kind of, missteps and kind of questions around how to actually articulate the value of software as it's used alongside a drug. It hasn't even really been possible to market the value of software with drugs, both because you can't make medical claims for something that's not a medical device, but also because there are anti-kickback concerns about giving away things of value alongside a drug. So the way that we see this really solves for a lot of those challenges and kind of lays out, how one could go about doing this. It's still draft guidance. They introduced draft guidance at the end of 2023. A lot of this is still being kind of finalized, but overall, it really lays the foundation for how pharma can move forward in this space, how, a lot of digital health companies can jump in on this. And, for patients who obviously are going to have a lot of value from software solutions that can provide behavioral health support or, dosing support or kind of personalizing the experience or even digital prognostics to be able to predict disease severity or flares. There's a lot of ways where you could use software alongside a drug where you could benefit patients in many ways.
The interesting part to me, and I still remember some of those discussions back in pharma, it's, when you pair a drug with a, digital therapy technology, there was always these internal discussions on, well, is there an uplift for that particular brand? What's the impact on it? How do you size it? How do you market it? And I think this is, again, I know it's draft guidance, but I think, as this moves forward, I agree with you. I mean, it opens up all kinds of opportunities for these manufacturers, for the younger companies to truly start partnering up with pharma, where a pharma can ultimately actually look at those outcomes and the pairings, right? And, maybe I'll just jump back to Andy real quick. Again, being kind of at a DTA level, are you seeing, say, more companies? Because I know, many of the startups were sort of like, well, we have our own standalone, but we're also partnering with pharma. Yeah, we're doing also a clinical trial here because we can get a $50K or $100K funding. So I'm curious, with Purduers, are you seeing more activity towards pharma again as some of these digital health units are being disassembled, to be frank?
Yeah. So towards pharma and from pharma, I can tell you the conversations that I've had in the last probably 3 months compared to the previous year, I don't know, 10,000% more. I don't know. Just questions about what can be done, what they're looking at, even like what types of companies they should be talking to. It's a lot of curiosity, but it's still like realistic and practical curiosity. So it's more thinking about what this looks like from a marketing and regulatory perspective in pharma, as opposed to just maybe how do we supplement, our patient services? Now it's how do we improve the effectiveness of our drug? And we know we can use digital to do that. And, I think it comes at the perfect time because we've seen clinical validation now for 10 years. How it actually is incorporated into the care paradigm is now starting to become really clear. And I think that's why we're seeing this interest from pharma, and the PRDERS pathway kind of coincides perfectly with that. Marty just jumped on it, before any of us saw the potential. He was out there screaming it from the rafters.
I was going to say, from a patient perspective, it makes perfect sense for whether it's drugs or therapy or people that aren't ready for either of those per se, like digital therapeutics that can be combined or like a part of the equation makes so much sense. And I think there's a different use case or value prop for those different segments, but it would have been leaving something important like out of the equation, not to think about how do we get to drug and digital therapeutic pairing.
And how do you guys see, and I'll open it up, tactically, right? So assuming, again, while this is draft guidance, assume this goes forward, what does that look like? And, I don't want to pick players like Click, who's kind of, I'd say, almost bet on it before PRDERS was even there, right? But others, what does this look like tactically, right? And even from a business model perspective?
I can jump in on this one. So tactically, there's a lot of questions, right? So I think a lot of the kind of nuances have not been thought through by anybody yet. How is this going to be prescribed, right? What if you have a software with a wearable? What if you have software with a medical device? There's a lot of questions around, kind of what if you start with the medical device first, then go to CEDAR? What if you go to CEDAR first, without having a regulated software yet? There's a lot of different ways to do this and a lot of permutations to kind of think through. And so what we're trying to do together with DTA is trying to get ahead of a lot of these questions and then make sure that there aren't any, hurdles or roadblocks kind of as the industry kind of gets there. And then from a kind of commercial model standpoint, I think there's, just to emphasize, this is not something where we expect there to be any, direct reimbursement for the software. Like you said, Eugene, is definitely an area where you're going to have commercial uplift to a drug, at least in the first, go around for this. And so I think there's just a need to identify where the gaps are with certain brands and then be able to, kind of find the best solution for that instead of kind of coming at it from the solution in search of a problem kind of standpoint.
And a trackable differentiator, right? So if you have products that have been out, even generic products, et cetera, I think it's a trackable differentiator for whatever the life sciences company that's investing in this. This was a good lightning fast, probably a 40,000-foot view. There's lots of unknowns, and this is just healthcare. But let's jump to the next topic. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with a special DTx Tailwinds episode. Typically in July of every year, CMS publishes this really, really, really long document, physician fee schedule. And I'm curious, and maybe Kirsten, you can kind of take us through this. Many times there's obviously lots of things going on the Hill, for it to happen. So maybe take us through what happened this July. What does it mean? How much work was before July 1st or whenever the schedule was published? And we'll tackle other questions as we go along.
Great. Absolutely. To kind of start with the end of your question, this has been a multi-year process. As Marty mentioned, we at AdvaMed have been looking at this issue for a number of years because when you look at digital therapeutics, they don't fit neatly into what are called Medicare benefit categories. So the things Medicare is statutorily allowed to pay for. And so a lot of what we have done over those years, alongside folks like Andy at DTA and the folks at CTA and others, is say there are ways to look at these benefit categories to rate them as being more expansive. The way that I've explained this to folks who aren't familiar with this is that the benefit categories were written at a time where iron lungs were being actively used in the United States. They don't contemplate a world where everyone carries a supercomputer in their pocket. And so, we both worked with the agency and with folks on the Hill to help them understand not only the availability of pathways, if you kind of look at them expansively within existing Medicare categories, but then to also say that there are likely needs, given the rapid expansion of technology, to expand those categories as well. And so kind of pursuing this dual track, if you will, of advocating with the agency to think creatively and working with the Hill to also kind of push the boat out on some of these things to ensure that, frankly, Medicare patients don't get left behind as technology continues to evolve. I think, frankly, the pandemic was actually really helpful for this environment because there were a number of rapid turn flexibilities implemented that expanded patient access to these types of technologies in physiologic and therapeutic monitoring. That said, patients in the Medicare population can use these high-tech technologies, and we are seeing benefits both in very rural populations where they lack access to providers, but also in urban areas where you might have transit issues or lack of access due to volume to different providers. So we have worked with the agency for a number of years specifically to advocate for this, what we call an incident to pathway under the benefit categories, where services that are given by a physician have incident to supplies, and those are covered under this subcategory of the Medicare physician benefit. And so what CMS has proposed to do in this year's rulemaking is to expand coverage for what they are calling digital mental health technology devices, or DMHT. And those are digital therapeutics for mental health conditions that are being furnished to a Medicare patient incident to their behavioral health treatment by that treating physician or clinician. It sounds very complicated. It basically means that there is a direct connection between a patient and a mental health provider who is allowed to bill Medicare, and that provider will give that patient, or can now give that patient, if this is finalized, access to a digital therapeutic to use alongside their other treatment protocols. This is huge. It's the first time that CMS has directly expanded access to these technologies. And while I think everyone on this phone could argue both sides of it, historically, Medicare has been the neck that turned the head of coverage policy in the United States. They cover so many lives. And now that this is actually also proposed to be explicitly covered by Medicare, we'll also get things like Medicare Advantage lives. It expands the likelihood that Medicaid will expand access in a more expansive way. And ultimately, we see this as a massive, massive moment for digital therapeutics that could stand to prove the benefits of these technologies in a discrete population, and then look to expand them to additional indications over time as Medicare becomes more comfortable with the process and the technologies associated with the policy.
Before we jump to tactical, this was an amazing overview. I'd love to understand a little bit, and for our listeners as well. So July 1st, the PFS is published. There's a lot of work that went into it ahead of time. I do remember there's a comment period. We're familiar at your coach. There were some test codes that were issued in PFS last year for health coaching as well. So I'm trying to understand what happens next, comments, and is this a proposed on temporary basis, or this is it? This is going from year to year?
So this is proposed to be a permanent policy. The comment period ends on September 9th at roughly 5:00 p.m. The machine allows you to submit comments a little later. Ask me how I know. And
you have your alarm set.
Yeah, I've got multiple alarms set. And so what we will see is we'll see the final rule for this about 30 days after the comment period ends, end of October, beginning of November, because CMS is required to issue these policies with 60 days before the effective date, which will be January 1st, 2025. So theoretically and kind of programmatically speaking, if these policies are finalized as proposed, then the HCPCS codes, which are permanent but CMS maintained codes that are in the proposed rule, could be billed starting January 1st. Functionally, and kind of how that actually happens with billing is different. It will take time to see what the actual payments look like and how long it takes for them to be processed. But if things are finalized as proposed, starting Jan 1, we've got DMHT coverage, which again is just very exciting, hence the bright earlier.
2025.
Yes, exactly. And 2025.
Back to the keyword here. I love it. And Jenna, I just going to jump to you on this one. And I don't usually pick favorites, but I've been following Big Health from, I think, literally day zero. Just again, I still remember some of the very early kind of dark room discussions with Peter back in the day. I think you guys have, truly the focus on accessibility, the initially non-FDA route, right? It's really just access, but also, tons of RCTs proving your value. and the evolution, and what a perfect timing on the FDA approval. I mean, you guys couldn't have timed it any better, really. But I want to, aside from some comments on that from you, I want to know what a company like Big Health, what does this truly look like tactically, right? From a business perspective, from an operational perspective, given the fact there's still a little bit of question marks, even though it's in PFS, things could change. So I'll hand it off to you just to talk it from Big Health perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're so excited as well. And this is really what we've been advocating for and planning around for many years. And so, ultimately, we have had an employer-focused channel for distributing our digital mental health programs for many years, since around 2014 in the US. And even earlier, we have had a UK-focused health system distribution channel. And so what we've always wanted in the US, and so what we've been planning for, is to extend the channel in the US to include health systems as well, which is what the new Medicare physician fee schedule proposed codes would allow. And we ultimately think that both employer and traditional coverage via Medicare, and we expect will be extended to commercially insured populations to follow. We think those are both really important in the US. It allows us to meet individuals where they're at in terms of what type of help they need around sleep or other areas of mental health. So, we ultimately felt like that foundation and employer has been really wonderful in the US. And it's allowed us a lot of innovation and learning. And we think it's also very important to have this more traditional distribution reimbursement model, because that, ultimately we've always had the vision of really being within traditional healthcare, being distributed by providers, being reimbursed by traditional insurers. And that's really what's going to allow us to reach more Americans that need help for chronic insomnia in particular. So yeah, we think it's game changing. This is really bringing, the future to us now.
Again, you guys have been at it, right? And, I always like to say, right, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. And this is not easy. And actually reaching those prescribers who are, just hard to reach, they're busy. So I think from an operational perspective, I'm still kind of wondering what that looks like. And maybe even, I don't know, Kirsten and the others comment just, what's the incentive for those docs, right? The prescribers, what does that fee schedule look like today? Is it a prescriber fee? Does a Big Health, if you're prescribed, get a certain fee? So maybe you guys, again, talk to me a little bit about that and our listeners.
I'm happy to take a quick pass at that first, which is to say, part of the reason myself as a clinician, just feel so much lighter with this new code proposal is that we have been getting inbound demand from providers from every major health system across the country for years. And so we have this list, which the last time we calculated, it was over 50 million patient lives under the care of the providers that have reached out to us and said, we would love to have your Sleepio program for our patients. We cannot possibly meet the demand for patients that have sleep problems. We don't want to prescribe the medications that are meant to be second line. How do we get access? And then the question is, well, who's going to pay for it? And there has been no payment pathway. And so the provider demand for treatments like ours is huge. That doesn't mean that there aren't still operational questions, as you say, but we feel that we are serving a market that's been asking for a long time. When it gets into the tactics of operations, this is typically what they call a buy and bill model, meaning that the provider buys the device from the manufacturer, and then they administer the patient, they submit for reimbursement and do that aspect of the process. That's the same model that you might use for vaccines or, other types of products that, physicians have in their offices. This, because it's digital, is probably easier from an inventory standpoint, but it's ultimately, it's a known model and it's one that health systems use or familiar with. What's great about these particular proposed codes is they do not have the complexity that the RTM code framework has, which was one that we know was really daunting for providers to use. And so it wasn't the kind of code that just anyone was able to kind of pick up and run with. We believe that these type of code, the new proposed codes, should be operationally far less complex for a provider to track and submit, provide the right documentation to submit reimbursement for.
So In January, in theory, 2025, we have an eligible population of, I think, 60 plus million in Medicare. And then my understanding is then typically there's Medicaid that may follow with eligibility. And then in the process of the commercial plans for back to the employer population that ultimately, whether it's self-insured or not. Is that the progression? So I would say, Jenna, maybe it's 2025 and 2026.
Yeah. Well, so we certainly know that there'll be natural slowness in using a new set of codes and beginning to make inroads into health systems where so we have been working with some health systems, but there's many that we have not been, of course. And so, yes, we expect that there'll be some kinks to work out, but there's a lot of provider groups, they're experiencing real gaps in their care. So I think with the demand and need, it should be easier to start to work out those kinks and get to scale. But we do expect, I would love to hear other people's thoughts, but my understanding is once Medicare has established this as standard reimbursed coding, that it would be likely that plans would cover for their commercially insured populations. Medicare doesn't usually cover less than commercially insured. And again, we know there's going to be lots of demand and we'll be able to showcase lots of great health economic and other improvements through having these products available to people. So we expect that to happen pretty quickly.
If I can just underscore some of the things that Jenna has been saying and kind of go back to the beginning, right? Treating patients for insomnia, digital therapeutics is the only solution. There will not ever be enough doctors to deliver CBTI. And up until this point, we were saying to providers who treat sleep and, other behavioral health and mental health issues, adopt these new technologies. By the way, your patients are going to have to pay out of pocket, and you as a doctor are not going to get paid to adopt these because there's no reimbursement for you. Back in 2018, when I started selling into payers and hospital systems and things, we're like, hey, look, it's a new modality. It's going to be great. That I was not in insomnia, but I'm like, by the way, your doctors aren't going to get paid for adopting this. And patients might have to pay out of pocket. Just talk about stifling innovation. And here we are, 2025, completely different landscape.
Let's shift the topic because again, and let's put 8816 to the side just for a second. Just between the PDURs and the CMS PFS, there has to be then, an adoption. Let's talk about kind of investment cycles. We've seen investments, yes, broadly speaking, but, specifically into digital therapeutics have dwindled, right? And again, it's a market dynamic. This is not unique to the DTx. And I think, what just Jenna talked about, potential big uplift to big health on this news. How are we seeing the business models adapt with PDURs and the CMS PFS? And maybe, I don't know, I'll kick it off to Andy first, just because, again, you've seen the broader picture across the, I'll say, across the industry and the investments.
Investments are not my specialty, but we do have an investor advisory board. And, capital markets are coming back to what we're hearing, the 2019 levels. And we're also seeing the digital investments from things like Mark Sluice that does his report and Rock Health that show that it's improving. And, all of this comes together. The excitement of seeing reimbursement pathways bring this back together, but also the artificial intelligence focus, investment there. A lot of digital therapeutics are AI driven. Care at home or aging in place, same thing. So money that you're hearing about flowing is actually starting to open up into digital therapeutics, but you might hear it underneath of different pillars, I should say.
My only concern is something that I flared up. I think with the impatience of investors, especially in this market, the question becomes kind of, I'll call it the new innovative digital therapies because of the R&D cycle. Are we going to start seeing this, right? And I think, companies that have been around like Big Health and others, and those companies scaling, I think that, in my opinion, will push, further investments into this industry.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure whatsoever.
I think that goes back to Jenna talking about 2025. Right now we're seeing the preparation for 2025. Right. We're seeing people talk about different areas of investment. We're having people talk about how these codes will be used in the real world. And that's all going to drive what you're talking about. So it's still going to be some time. It's not happening overnight.
Yeah. And jumping in here also, I think a lot of interest is in solutions that are kind of better integrated into sort of the healthcare system, right? So like solutions that can be, integrated into the pharma ecosystem, for example, right? If you have a digital therapeutic or digital disease management solution that might be integrated with the patient support solution, that way the patient's kind of able to be managed in kind of a ecosystem throughout the kind of end-to-end care journey. Definitely solutions that are integrated into health systems in some way. There's a lot of kind of virtual care, and kind of integrated solutions like that. And then, if you can get pulled in to the standard of care, for example, insomnia, right? CBT is the first line treatment for insomnia, right? So if you can kind of fit into guidelines, fit into some kind of existing ecosystem, integration is kind of where a lot of this is going. And kind of the days of having like a, point solution kind of on the sidelines that doesn't really have any integration in anything, that's kind of where we're going to see less interest from investors.
Certainly, people are paying attention. This changes things to have Medicare reimbursement on the table. Of course, I think it's an environment of investors looking for proof points. And we think that's a good thing, really, right? So it's just investing in pace with growth. And I think, as Marty was saying, it's not going to be the same for every condition or every digital therapeutic. There are places where I think that for whatever reason, demand and the coding is going to line up better first, and then we'll be able to get some really strong success stories there. But I think we're in good position to do that.
We've talked where we've been a little bit. We didn't touch too much on it because we don't want to go there. We talked about where we are now, and I'd love for each of you guys kind of, however far you want to, predict what that looks like. What does the industry look like? What's next? What's next for DTx? Who wants to volunteer before voluntold?
I'll go fast before, since I just kind of spoke on this, is that really the future to me is both integration and personalization. So the more that you can focus on those two aspects, the more value you can provide to the healthcare system as a whole and to patients, because as we all know, digital can be personalized in many ways. And that's really where, a lot of the value is going to be driven from.
I could piggyback on that. I agree. I think it is very much about good integration into the clinical workflow within health systems. And I think that is going to be what gets a great repeatable cycle of providers having a good experience with using a digital therapeutic, patients having a good experience, the overall health system benefiting in terms of, improving their care, making more life guidelines, improving efficiencies in their operations. And I think once we demonstrate that in a couple examples, then we're going to be able to scale that. And I would just say that I do think areas like insomnia, which we're focused on, are just prime because we supported Milliman to do a large study a couple of years ago. And for older adults on Medicare, the number that are getting guideline recommended care is almost none. And so it is a real pain point for providers and health systems. And so I think when we can start with a place like that, we'll really be able to get a strong integration that's, working for all parties involved. And then we should be able to scale to other areas as well.
Kirsten, maybe from policy perspective?
Yeah, I think to kind of build from Jenna's side, I think the goal for me over the next few years is continued expansion, both within the existing kind of proposed PFS pathway, as well as looking at those technologies which don't really fit into that PFS pathway, things that have a durable component, or looking at more home-based care. And that kind of the 8816 point will require some more thinking. How do we get both CMS to continue to think expansively, because we have seen it work now, but where they cannot do anything further, to work with folks like legislators to say that these are really critical access issues for the Medicare population, and work to remove those barriers so that we can continue to expand access to these types of really great innovations in a large patient population.
And I think the only thing I'll add, because three of you has really great points, is, to make digital therapeutics make sense to people in 2015 and 2016, when you could almost not even fathom what it would be, we kind of had to be like, this is the only model, or this is the only way, right? And now when we see adoption on a global scale and we start seeing pharma get involved, the employer market has been involved in this space for a long time, we don't need just one model. And digital can be part of everything from how you take your drugs, managing side effects of drugs, individual treatment for mental health where there are no other providers, over-the-counter type products. We're seeing all of it. And I think people are ready to kind of hear that there are all these different models and there's all these different ways to bring these products to patients and help them in their care pathway. And with that, it's just opening up a lot more opportunities, like PDERs. In 2014, people would have been like, PDERs, I don't know if that makes sense. And now people get it. And so I think we're going to continue to see that evolution while DTA and AdvaMed and CTA, we focus on expansion of some of these very, key areas. We're still going to be thinking big picture, and we're going to be looking to the manufacturer of these products to continue to innovate and think of what can possibly come next. And so, we'll see the transition next year, and the world will continue to open up in different ways.
Thank you, all of you guys, for joining on relatively short notice. Thank you, and I will be cheerleading from the sidelines. I did try to get Brian Dolan on this with us to be a bit of the naysayer and challenge all of us, because I'm a big fan, and so is he. But in any case, again, thank you for joining on short notice, and we'll keep everybody posted. Thanks for tuning in to Digital Therapeutics edition of Digital Health Today, a production of Mission-Based Media. If you made it this far, you're a true fan, and I would kindly ask you to rate this podcast and pass it on to your colleagues. If you'd like to learn more about sponsorship opportunities across mission-based media assets, feel free to reach out to hello@missionbasedmedia.com. If you'd like to learn more about Your Coach, a company I'm building with my amazing wife, drop us a note at team@yourcoach.health. I'm Eugene Borukhovich, and catch you next time.